So welcome back to the PolSocPodcast Screencast. This is episode number 2. We're going to expand our repertoire a little bit this week by working on our preparing and structuring of our essays, both for class essays and ultimately for the essays you're going to write in June in your Leaving Cert. So we'll do that by working through a sample essay, although it's not a sample essay that you should be learning off by heart, not the banking method, but rather an essay that you can use to structure your own work. It deals with one of the topics in the human rights section on children's rights, particularly whether the rights articulated in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child are enjoyed equally by everybody in Ireland. Although I think in the spec they really should have said equally by all the children in Ireland, but that's just my little quibble. So there will also be, as always, a list of additional resources to go along with this essay that you can find in the episode notes page. Now, I had to put a special little title in here for the screencast notes. You'll find things like the case study handouts, a listen along guide like normal, where you can go and instead of you being presented with data, you can use the listen along guide to go and search for the most up-to-date data that will help you in writing your essay. So let's dig in. Again, sorry for the quality of the slide here. When I zoom it up, it gets a bit mushy, but it's important to understand where the essays you're being asked to prepare come from. This comes from Learning Outcome 4.1 on the spec, and you'll see here that it is basically summarised research evidence on whether these rights are enjoyed equally by everybody. It's looking at the rights in the previous section. And how do we do that? We do that by evaluating and using evidence, and also bearing in mind some of the terminology that's needed for a human rights essay. Here we have the idea of who is a rights holder and a duty bearer. The rights holder are the children in this case, who are entitled to avail of rights, and the duty bearer is, I suppose, everybody in society, but particularly the state in this context. So what might this look like in an exam? Now, this is really, really important, and in terms of your essays in the exam, it's important not to get too distracted by the stimulus material. Now, generally what happens in the exams, and I've written a number of sample mock papers over the last couple of years, generally what you get, there's 2 sections to each question. There's the stimulus material at the top, which could be here like a cartoon. It could be a quotation from a famous person, from a key thinker. It could be a tweet from Leo Varadkar, as they have in the first year, or Tánaiste Simon Coveney in the second year, or just a straight up question. But basically, you'll have the stimulus material, and then you'll have the core question. Now, the core question is the bit that's drawn straight from the specifications and is really what the question you're being asked to respond to is. And how I describe it to my students is I say you should be using sprinkles of the stimulus material to inspire or to provoke your reaction to the main section. Now, if you look at this stimulus material, it's basically talking just about Article 13 of the UN CRC. It's not asking you just to respond to Article 13. This is the starting point for your essay. Okay, so don't get bogged down. If you think, oh, I don't know much about Article 13, you shouldn't be panicking and saying, I can't answer this question if you can do all the rest. So this is just a way of flavouring your answer. So let's think about planning an overall response to this question. And a phrase I use, a slightly more colourful version of this sometimes, but I always say ATFQ, answer the flippin' question. So what ways can you directly answer the question, are the rights enjoyed equally? So either they are enjoyed equally, and bearing in mind that could be equally well or equally poorly, or they're not enjoyed equally. So even within the fact that they're not enjoyed equally, maybe some people, disproportionately, some people enjoy them. Overwhelmingly, most people enjoy them and only some people don't. Or is it only an exclusive group of people are able to do that? So you can frame your answer relative to all of those aspects of the question. So you'll have to pick one of those ways of framing it and work from there. So if you're talking about it not being enjoyed equally, you could bring in an element of class, social class, gender, citizenship status, ethnicity, or sexuality. So there's a whole load of different ways of framing this, and depending on how you frame it, it will influence what kinds of key thinkers you want to discuss. One of the other elements to bear in mind here is that Ireland historically has had an exceptionally poor record in child protection. You don't have to look much further than the Magdalen Laundries, the Fern Report, or the Irish Child Abuse Commission report, which was something in the order of 2,600 pages of a report issued in 2009, which outlined just how poorly the state had allowed mainly religious institutions, to cover up huge abuse within the system. I don't advise digging too deeply into those because they are quite upsetting in places, but it's not something we can ignore. And referring to those reports within the introduction, saying why this is important, is an important way of framing your response as well. So how are we going to go about introducing our essay? So if you're being asked, are the rights of the UNCRC enjoyed by people? You first of all have to explain what some of those rights are. Now, you're free to mention any rights you want, of course, within your essay, but within the specifications, within the subject spec, or what you would kind of think of as the curriculum, there are a number of specific ones articulated, in other words, mentioned in the spec that you need to be aware of and could use as the basis of your essay. So Article 6 there, survival and development. Article 13, freedom of expression, and that's 12 and 13 in together really, and that relates to our stimulus material, which is why I picked that piece of stimulus material in the first place. Then Article 19 is abuse and neglect. Articles 28 and 29 refer to education, and this is where you could bring in our Kathleen Lynch, as we'll see in a second. And then Article 31, which is leisure, recreation, and cultural activities, access to those things, which incidentally was one of the citizenship project titles in the very first year of the subject, and students had to investigate that. So they've already shown that they like to mention these specific children's rights issues within the exam process, which is great. But as I said, you can pick any right you want from that list that you've gone off and investigated. Now, in the episode notes to this episode, you will find I have summarized some of those articles that are mentioned in the spec at the end of the children's rights handout. So you could go and have a look at them very, very quickly if you wanted to pause the video here, have a quick read of those things so that you're up to speed. Once you have gotten back on track here, the second thing that you need to be including within your introduction, I suggest to all my students, there's lots of different ways to do this, but I suggest that everyone mentions the key thinkers that they're going to refer to up front. Now, why do I suggest this? Well, first of all, in the exam, the timing of the exam is very, very short. And if you at least have mentioned the relevant key thinkers, it shows that you're on the right track, rather than losing a chunk of marks because you haven't done something that's required of you. So if you're going to talk about access to care and education, Kathleen Lynch is the obvious choice. In her conclusion at the end, we'll come back to Martha Nussbaum and her capabilities approach. But if you're bringing in social class or gender, Marx or Walby might be suitable thinkers to add in at some point. Now we're going to get into the core element of the essay, the kind of the bulk of your main response paragraphs. Now, again, there are lots of different ways to approach this. Here are 4 different ways that you could structure this area. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to have 4 separate paragraphs for each of these. Some might pair in nicely together, but you will have to go off and dig out the evidence for each of these. And if you go into the episode notes, you can just click through straight on the links within those notes, within the resource notes that are there, to get a kind of shortcut to some of these things. So we've got a couple of areas that will be useful to you when you do this. So you have your Ombudsman for Children, which is the official human rights body in Ireland. You have the Children's Rights Alliance, which is an NGO. Now you could refer to other NGOs like Childline or Barnardo's, who do talk about children's rights, but this is very specific to human rights. There's also the IHREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and they are kind of the overview body that deals with all of the human rights in Ireland, so they would have a lot to say about this kind of thing too. And then finally, taking a kind of a political dimension, you might say, well, what has the Minister for Children, who the outgoing minister was Catherine Zappone in this context, we don't know who the next one will be, but it won't be her because she lost her seat, but what does that ministerial body say about how they protect children's rights? So one thing you could do now is you could pause the video and you could go back and dig into each of those links to say, well, what is the approach that they say? What data can I gather? And you can fill in that data on the sheet to help you have a concise pool of information to draw from in your essays. Obviously, you don't have to specifically talk about those things. You can bring in other things. You could refer to newspaper articles that you read. You could refer to documentaries, and there have been some very, very moving documentaries recently on elements of Irish human rights and human rights, particularly in around those reports that I talked about. There's other government reports as well that feature, and if you can identify any of them, be a good student and put the links to those things in the comments box below so that other students can learn from you. So this is an excellent place to bring in your first of your key thinkers, and you might think about dedicating one full paragraph to exploring this area. The thing to do here, though, is to link in specifically to the areas of the issues that Kathleen Lynch highlights with the specific articles in the UNCRC to show that you're making the link between the big global idea and the national question. And you'll also want to try and say, well, which are the ones that link best in with my overall argument? So if you're making a social class argument, you might be talking about grinds and the lack of availability depending on how much money you have. Are girls being treated differently in schools? Can they access their rights equally? And then what I always suggest is that you balance the ideas of the key thinkers, the abstract ideas and the national perspective with your personal perspective. This is a good way of showing that you've synthesized or taken in lots of different perspectives and included them all in the same paragraph. And I always ask my students to write an I sentence. What's the I sentence here? And if you want to get some help in how you develop that I sentence, if you go to the Kathleen Lynch notes in the Key Thinker notes on the website, page 3 of that handout has a few of the different areas that Lynch herself identifies as areas of inequality within Irish education, and you can give your response to them. I've left a little space for that personal response too. Now, this is one element of the course which is a little bit of a trick within the marking scheme. There is 15% of your essays the marks are allocated for, quote, alternative and comparative perspectives. So if there's 15% of the marks going for it, you have to be very conspicuous in showing the examiner that you are doing these things. So if we want to put Ireland into context, Ireland does certain things and has some strengths and some weaknesses, but how do we understand that in a global perspective, for example? We might ask ourselves, what does UNICEF say about Ireland's performance or about global performance in human rights? What does the Kids' Rights Index say? This is one of the measurements that's developed by an NGO in the Netherlands that measures different elements of how different countries are performing. Go and have a look. Where does Ireland come in the rankings? Who's at the top? Who's at the bottom? And what can we learn from that? Each different element of that index also breaks down into subcategories. So you can look and say, well, we're doing particularly well in this area, but quite poorly in another. The next thing you could do is look at how did the UN measure this? So you could do it either through the Committee on the Rights of the Child or elements that are submitted in the periodic review, both of which does a lot of data for, a lot of qualitative and quantitative data. But with the Universal Periodic Review, remember, it tends to be 5 years in that review process. So the last one is 2016, and from 2021 you'll have up-to-date data on that. So you might, with both the Kids' Rights Index and the UPR, you might want to come back to this stuff to update your data after you've looked at it in the first instance. And one of the good things to do with these sets of data is to say, well, hang on a second, how have we progressed over time? Have we gotten better or worse at any of these things? And how does that help us to understand what's going on? So if you have managed to track down other perspectives that you thought were valuable and helped you to put Ireland into context, you could put the links to those things or just mention them in the comments box below the video so that other students can benefit from what you've learned. And again, I'll have links to all of those areas in the red boxes in the resource page and in the description box below, so you can dig into them for yourself. Oftentimes, I've noticed in my own students' answers that they tend to be very, very generalized. So one thing that I've found that's really, really useful is in terms of adding data, both qualitative and quantitative data, is to include specific case studies that help you to illustrate elements of your answer. So in the notes, you'll see 2 specific case studies that I refer to. The first is the 31st Amendment to the Constitution referendum, which was on specifically articulating children's rights within the Irish Constitution, which basically moved, the primacy of the role of the family slightly off to the side and articulated those rights specifically for children. Now, there's a few elements to this that might be relevant to how you put together a paragraph in discussing it. So you want a little bit of background on where did the referendum come from. You also want to be able to say what were the arguments in favour and against, and I include a couple of articles relative to that. You also want to say what was the result of the referendum. It was passed, but by what margin, and that's important. And one of the particularly interesting things on this referendum was the very, very low turnout. Does that mean that people weren't engaged, weren't interested, or does it mean that everybody assumed that it would pass, so didn't bother? turning up to the polls to cast their vote. And there'll be lots of quantitative data within that, lots of numbers, which will really enrich your paragraphs. The second of those two case studies then is the Ombudsman for Children's report. They have little mini case studies that illustrate a lot of their ideas, and they take the case of a hypothetical case based on a real case, I understand, called the Molly case, which examines how they vindicated her rights. So if the Ombudsman for Children is putting this out, we have to look at that critically, as we would look at any other case study critically, and say, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this case study? And if you can provide some area within your essay where you are showing the examiner that not only are you providing data, but you're thinking about the validity and reliability of the sources, then that's a particularly good one. What I would do if I was you looking at the Molly 2 years on case study would be to say, okay, what specific quotations can I take here? What does the Ombudsman themselves say about this situation, and how can I use that quotation or quotations in my essay in a way that really helps my examiner to see that I've engaged with the ideas at hand. And then finally, our conclusion. All good PolSoc essays have a clear conclusion. Now, if you haven't managed to shoehorn in a second key thinker, you might have talked about Walby or Marx earlier on, this is an opportunity to fill that gap. And I think Martha Nussbaum in any human rights essay is a particularly useful person to talk about, because yes, maybe the rights that are on the books that are written into the various conventions, maybe they are available to people, but what if you don't have the capability to access them? What's the point of having a computer with loads of programs on it if you can't access the computer, if you don't know the password? And many children particularly don't know or aren't aware of the rights that they are entitled to, or how to vindicate or get themselves sorted under those rights. The second element to your conclusion that you can bear in mind, and this applies to all essays obviously, is don't just be limited by the question, go beyond it. So here, don't just say these are the problems, this is how Ireland rates. What are the possible solutions to the problem? Do we have a case here where you can look at the global perspective and say, having looked at what they do in the top ranking countries, Ireland could do those things too. And you can say, okay, here is how I would summarize it for the minister. Here's what I would say to the minister for children, or here's what I would say to the Taoiseach if we were asked, as we should be, based on the stimulus material, which is having your position heard. And then the final thing I would do, and this goes back to our ATFQ answer the flipping question, is I would close off my essay by returning to the question. Sum up what you've said based on the preponderance of evidence. That means basically having seen everything, having presented you with a wide range of evidence, looking at it from different perspectives, here is the conclusion I have drawn. And if you get a chance to return back to the stimulus material, that's a particularly useful thing to do, but you must go back to the core question. You must try that. Now, I can't stress this enough. There are suggestions within this video of how you might go about answering some of these questions, some of the possible paragraphs, but this is just one of probably 20 different ways that I could think of addressing this answer. So you shouldn't see this as prescriptive. You don't have to now go off and learn all of these specific case studies, but you might want to go and update what you've done or bring in some of your own classwork paired up with some of these things, whatever you think works best to respond to the stimulus material that you're presented in the exam. So this is one way to answer the question, not the only way to do it. Before you finish, you might consider liking and subscribing to the channel so that other students can find it more easily. And you could also include some of your own findings in the comments below to help everybody else. And I do want to offer a special thanks. There's been a very busy process with my 10-year-old son Owen teaching me how to record and edit these videos. Hopefully we'll be back soon with more videos for you to use within your essays. And don't forget to go and look at the extra resources within the website so that you are building on, not just copying from this video. And remember, you're not apart from society, you're a part of society. See you next time.